I'm loving the intros in the chat. I'm going to keep us moving right along to Matt, who, as I mentioned, is going to be talking about climate change and political polarization, but also collaboration, which hopefully you will all find very relevant and inspiring at this time. And Matt, you should have the ability to share your screen, but let me know if you don't.
Let's see. You'll see that?
Looks good.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm currently an assistant professor of economics at the University of Wyoming. I used to be in series, so I'm familiar with Clean, big fan. Appreciate you all having me. And I forgot the title that I gave, so I made up a new one. Uh, but it's on a similar theme. I do work on political polarization. The two areas that I do the most work on in political polarization are climate change and higher ed. So never a dull moment right now. And I want to talk about some just an overview of some of what we found in our group and just general state of knowledge on climate change polarization and where common ground is. And then if we have time, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think the next 4 years might look like. Looks like I only have 15 minutes, so I'll do my best. All right, let's see.
It's okay
Now,
too if it is a little bit more than 15.
no,
Go
you're
ahead.
good. Well, I guess we'll see. Yeah, so one thing I want to start with, first of all, I sometimes start these talks with the following joke, which I found goes over better in Colorado with both liberal and conservative audiences than it does with certain audiences in Wyoming. But I'm not on a team. I come to this as a politically moderate Canadian, so I don't vote in your elections. And the joke I like to tell is that a politically moderate Canadian is somebody that people in Boulder mistake for a conservative, and American conservatives assume that I want to take their guns away, and that's true. Again, the joke goes over better in Colorado than Wyoming. But so for the point of all it being, I know that some, particularly on the political left in the United States, are quite concerned about what the second Trump administration might mean for climate change. And so one thing I just want to start to orient and remind everybody is I really think that you can't decarbonize all of society without both parties, no matter who is president. This is actually one of the reasons I got involved in researching climate change polarization, because it just struck me that, if we really mean all of society, then I just don't see how we're going to do it with just one party. And so, if you're coming into this thinking that Republican administration means, that there's new challenges for bridging divides on this issue, I would invite you to entertain the possibility that it's not actually a new challenge. It's just maybe a more salient one. All right, so I'm going to go really briefly through a couple of key facts about U.S. political polarization that I think are relevant for understanding some of what we found with respect to climate change. Couple of areas where I think there's both opportunities for common ground in terms of what the public wants, but also aligned political incentives for Democrats and Republicans. I think there's actually incentives are more aligned on this issue than people think, and even maybe on some other issues. And then I'm going to argue what I guess the next 4 years might look like, but I fully admit it's just a guess. And I'll provide a link at the end to a long blog post I wrote on this. Basically, a bunch of reporters were asking me after the election what was going to happen, and I don't know, but I was trying to think about it. All right, so a couple high-level facts about American polarization that I think are relevant and underappreciated. One is that most Americans are moderate, and that's especially true of the disadvantaged or people that we call marginalized. Conversely, it's the case that the extremes on both sides tend to be disproportionately white, educated, and affluent. I think when I talk to liberal audiences, people kind of intuitively, well, maybe both liberal and conservative audiences, I think, kind of understand that this is true about the other side, but they don't think it's true about their own side. Both the extremes on both sides think that they're for the little guy, and statistically that's not true. The people in the extremes tend to be affluent, tend to be hobbyists. The way I think of it is like if you're living on the margins, then politics affects your everyday life. You care a lot more about results than posturing. Whereas if you're in the extremes and politics is kind of part of your identity, it's like a shirt, and you want your shirt to be more colorful and attention grabbing than everybody else's shirt. By the way, I can't see the chat because I have full screen. So if a particularly pressing question comes up, feel free to interrupt me or flag one of the moderators. Okay, second thing that tends to surprise people, particularly in educated audiences, is that the median voter is economically progressive and socially conservative. There's this trope that I've heard in educated circles for basically my whole life, that the median voter is a economic fiscal conservative and a social liberal, but it's actually the opposite. And if you think about who the median voter is statistically, you're talking about a white Christian from the suburbs who's working class. Is that person going to be more likely to favor liberal economic policy or liberal social policy? I would argue it's pretty straightforward to imagine that it would be the way that it actually is. This is a plot of people's opinions clustered on social and economic dimensions. And again, there's liberals in both dimensions. There's conservatives in both dimensions. There's a lot of people who are economically progressive and socially conservative. There's not very many people who are the opposite, and they tend to disproportionately be elites, which is why this is a common elite delusion. Okay, Americans are less divided than we think. And I'm going to talk about this in three ways that I think that are pretty relevant for climate change. So one is that many policies have 2/3 or greater support. This isn't just true on climate change. This is true across a whole bunch of domains, including some of the ones that we think of as most contentious. So for example, immigration, most Americans support border security and merit-based immigration, but also support the Dreamers. On abortion, most Americans support legal first trimester abortions and illegal or restricted third trimester abortions. On climate change, here are a couple examples of what it looks like. So a black is everybody, and then it's split out by the four groups of partisans. One of the things that you see a lot on climate is that the divide isn't really between Democrats and Republicans. It's between the hard right and everybody else. But this is just so most people support U.S. participation in efforts to address climate change. 2/3 almost support steps to be carbon neutral by 2050 even. There's some partisanship, right? So people might support specific climate policies, but if you tie it to Biden, then Republicans go way down. It turns out this actually works the other way too. If you tell liberals that carbon tax policy is conservative, they lose about half their support compared to if you tell them it's liberal. These are more specific policy ideas. Republicans, Democrats, and everybody. And you can see, there's some that really are divisive, right? So requiring new buildings to be run on electricity with no gas lines. This is a big contentious issue on the CU Boulder campus with a new residence building, I believe. But you'd be surprised at how much consensus there is on other things. So requiring power plants to eliminate emissions by 2040. This one's pretty divisive, but you're still, north of 60% overall. Prioritizing alternative energy over fossil fuels, you're getting pretty close to 2/3. Taxing corporations on their emissions, you're over 2/3, I believe. Business tax credits for carbon capture and storage, you're way over 2/3. Closing gas leaks, etc. So there's lots of positions that have more than 2/3 support. But one of the reasons that people don't realize this is that Americans tend to underestimate support for popular policies and overestimate support for unpopular ones. Some the great postdoc who just finished in my group, who was trying to figure out why this is for climate change, and we thought that media bias was part of the answer, and to our surprise, we didn't find it. So we don't know why. I suspect it's just people, anything you tell somebody something's divisive, they assume that half the country's for it and half the country's against it. That's kind of my working theory. Here's what it looks like for climate change. So this is from a figure from Kath Landgren, who was my postdoc, based on survey data from this Sparkman et al. Paper. And this is asking people, what fraction of Americans support a carbon tax? The actual answer, at least in this survey, was a little bit north of 60%. On average, people said a little bit south of 40%. And you can see this distribution of individual answers. There's this bimodal distribution where conservatives are more often in the left side and the liberals are more often the right side. So people underestimate support, um, and but they also overestimate support for unpopular things. One of those being political violence. So another way we're less divided than we think, both Democrats and Republicans exaggerate their opponents' positions, underestimate their values, and overestimate their support for political violence and anti-democratic behavior. So here's just kind of one example of this. These are different types of political violence. So the bottom one is self-defense. So people actually do support self-defense in pretty decent numbers. But these are different types of political violence. And these bars are, how much do Republicans think Democrats support it? How much do Democrats think Republicans support it? And then how much do Democrats and Republicans actually support it? And you can see that support for political violence is much lower than we think it is. And there was actually a study, I think, that came out after this one that said that these numbers might also be biased. If you ask people kind of generally if they support political violence, they tend to give more support, even as low as it is, than if you give them specific examples of political violence. They tend to be turned off. And this kind of result applies for other types of divisions. So we're much more similar, united on values, less anti-democratic than we think our political opponents are. Okay, so now some stuff more specifically about climate change. Climate change certainly is a divisive issue. It wasn't a huge issue in this election in terms of the public discourse, uh, although in terms of kind of voters expressing a preference for parties, it was one of the biggest of all of them, with the preference for the Democrats' position. But if you just had an election of do something versus do nothing, do something would win the landslide. So this is the estimates by state of what fraction of adults think the president should do more to address global warming, right? Orangish means more than 50% and vice versa for blue. This would be a winning electoral college map for do something. And if you ask about Congress, it would be a landslide Senate map, except for my state, and congressional districts, it would be even more impressive. So there's definitely voters definitely prefer do something to do nothing, but there are some disagreements on the specifics that are important, I think, particularly for Democrats to understand. But certainly the Republicans, deservedly or not, and you could probably make the case that at least in the last two elections, President-elect Trump's statements suggest that it's at least somewhat fair. He said things like that it's a hoax, less in the current campaign, but certainly in the previous two campaigns. This perception that Republicans are more the party of do nothing than do something, we've estimated has probably hurt them in elections. So this is a figure from a report that we published from the Center for Social and Environmental Futures back when I was at Colorado. And this is voters in the 2020 presidential election, how important they rated climate change and who they voted for. And the width of the bars is what fraction of the population of voters that these answers represent. And basically, if you thought climate change was somewhat or very important, I think slightly more than 3/4 of these people voted for Joe Biden. And that includes Republicans who thought it was very important. About 1/4 of them voted for Joe Biden in 2020. And it's impossible to perfectly estimate the counterfactual, but our best guess was that this had an effect that hurt Trump enough to possibly cost him that election, all else equal. Okay, really quickly on the other side, though, Democrats don't win the public with everything they do. There's some evidence that they hurt themselves when they get too extreme or too into identity politics. So, for example, there's Pew polls that find that most Americans don't want to ban fossil fuels or fracking. We have a couple studies showing one case for legislators and one case for the public, that when you pair climate with explicitly race and gender-based social justice elements, you tend to lose moderates and conservatives. And then there's some evidence, I would say it's still circumstantial, so I could be wrong, but I lay it out in this law review article, and Hannah Ritchie describes her personal experience with this in her book, Not the End of the World. I'm fairly confident that climate catastrophism is probably contributing to the youth mental health crisis and probably hurting the credibility of some climate advocates when it's overblown. So just one specific example is when it looked like Joe Manchin might tank the Inflation Reduction Act, John Podesta said to the New York Times that that he thought that it was odd that Manchin would choose as his legacy to be the one person who single-handedly doomed humanity. The idea that the Inflation Reduction Act is the difference between humanity living or dying is nuts, to be blunt. And so, people who talk like that are not doing themselves favors in terms of their building their public credibility as experts or serious activists, I would argue. And we've all heard other types of things like that. But on the positive side, areas where I think that there's emerging consensus, one of them is that there's some areas that you might think of as traditionally conservative instincts whose interests are aligned with the transition. So one example that people have talked a lot about is permitting reform. This is how long it takes to get a permit for major transmission projects, solar and wind projects, in years, right? So you're talking like 5 to 10 years to get a permit. So if you want the Inflation Reduction Act to do its job, you're not going to have any shovels in the ground if you don't fix this. And then this, I just think is kind of ridiculous and embarrassing. Construction, this is American total factor productivity in the economy as a whole since 1950 versus construction. And our construction productivity is actually lower now than it was in 1950. So we're really bad at building things, and we claim to want to basically renovate our country's economy to make it low emissions. And so there's some areas I think for compromise, and there's a bipartisan bill on the floor for permitting reform right now, being led by Manchin and my senator in Wyoming, Barrasso. There are actually quite a lot of examples of bipartisan action on climate change. In the longer version of this talk, I have time to go into the details. In this talk, I don't, but we found over 100 bipartisan state-level decarbonization bills and dozens of Republican-only bills. These tended to do things like provide financial incentives for clean energy and things like that. There's bipartisan solutions caucuses in the House and Senate that include climate as their focus. One of the largest caucuses now in the House of Representatives is the Conservative Climate Caucus, which last time I looked had about a third of the GOP. And the head of that caucus, John Curtis, just replaced Mitt Romney as Utah's senator. So watch out for some bipartisan climate stuff in the Senate, maybe. There have been bipartisan federal bills that had climate aspects to them. There's the Chips and Science Act, was probably the most notable of that. There's this permitting reform bill. So there's quietly behind the scenes, there's actually quite a lot going on. Okay, really quickly, and again, I apologize that a short time, but happy to talk to anybody more if they want to email me. Just some quick thoughts on what I think we might see the next 4 years. And if you're interested, I have a Substack called Guided Civic Revival where I lay this out in I can't remember, but decently many words. And the punchline is, I expect the next 4 years to see a big change in rhetoric or vibes compared to the Biden administration. I expect some change in policy, but I actually don't expect that much change in the path of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll justify that here in a second and explain why. So this is a plot of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions from the Bush administration to now. You can kind of almost draw a line through it. It's about 1.1% decline per year. Pretty hard to discern the effects of different presidencies. The main effects you see are kind of recessions, which is kind of interesting. And then these are models from the group Carbon Brief. So this is the perfect world Biden policies projection. This is in other words, the Biden policies stay and work perfectly. This is their Trump scenario, which basically assumes that he gets rid of all of the Biden policies, which I don't actually think is super likely. I think a lot of parts of the IRA are likely to survive for reasons I'll explain in a second. But then the point I want to make is the dashed line here is this is a model of what happens if we keep all the Biden policies, but we can't build power lines any faster than we build them today. And you basically lose all of the almost all of the benefits. And this trajectory is pretty similar to the trajectory we're on. I hope we learn to build power lines faster and keep some of the Biden policies, but But if we don't, then we're, I think you're just going to see this line continue. Okay, clean energy investment. You do see a little bit of an uptick, right, following the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act in the second half of the Biden administration. But it's also steadily going up under Trump 1. And then if you look at fossil fuels, basically Obama, Trump, and Biden were all pretty bad times for coal, pretty good times for oil and for natural gas. And so why, despite the huge differences in vibes and preferences for some of these administrations, why have the trends not changed that much? And the answer is basically there's not as many levers of power in the president's office than we think. So, for example, the point that a lot of the actions in the private sector. This is a study that I did with a student of mine named Grace Krager, where we looked at who is more ambitious, utility decarbonization plans or state. All the purple and blue ones are ones where the utilities are more ambitious if you count nuclear, which I think you should. You even see, pretty ambitious decarbonization plans in some of these states that have no policies. I probably don't have time to get into why that is. But basically, the politics of climate are global. They're cross-regional in the US. State and local policies matter. Economics matter. Renewables are very competitive in a lot of places on economics, to the point where Texas is the biggest renewable producer in the country. So all that to say, I expect that the market forces are going to more or less stay the same in the sense that they're going to be good for renewables, probably good for oil and gas, at least to an extent, probably not good for coal. And then also, I think some of the Biden climate policies that are having an effect are going to be, I think, harder politically to get rid of, at least in kind of their most important parts, than some people think. So this is a plot of manufacturing investment over time, and you can see that Biden's policies, particularly the CHIPS Act and the IRA and the infrastructure law, really did cause this huge spike in manufacturing, which is something that President Trump in his first term said was a big priority, right? So is he really going to undo this? I'm not sure. Especially since Congress controls the purse strings. If you look where the IRA spending from the Inflation Reduction Act goes, mostly it goes to rural places, which is where you build solar and wind infrastructure. Most rural places are represented by Republicans. Wyoming is a really good case study for this. We have a Republican governor. We're the single Trumpiest state in the country by polls and election results. Yet we have a Republican governor who talks about all of the above and net zero and calls climate change an important problem. And he's the fourth most popular governor in the country. So all that to say, there's been some good reporting on this, for example, by Politico. There's more support for addressing climate change below the ticket than you might think. And even in the Trump himself, I would argue he softened his rhetoric a little bit on climate change in this campaign compared to the previous two. And if you look at who he's appointed to serve in climate relevant cabinet roles, they're all people who say that climate change is real and support an all of the above strategy. And you may think that it doesn't go far enough, but that's still maybe different from the previous Trump administration. Okay, one last thing I'll show. I know a lot of folks in places like Ceres and NOAA are concerned about this. This is a plot I made with the help of Waleed Abdulati, who's the director of Ceres. We dug up data on the White House budget requests and the actual congressional appropriations. And the point I want to make is that the first Trump administration, which I think is probably a little bit more hostile to climate funding, science, and climate policy than the current one may be, did try to cut the budget significantly. So this is the NOAA's office, OAR, Office of Atmospheric Research, which is where a lot of the climate science lives. So you do see big cuts proposed in the White House budget, but Congress actually steadily increased funding through both administrations. It actually fell a little bit in the Biden administration as it was competing with dollars with space stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that continue. Federal climate science and things like weather forecasting is pretty supported down ballot. Provides a lot of jobs in a lot of communities, including some purple and red places. So we'll see. But just to summarize, I think regardless of who's in the White House, we need to work together if we're serious that climate change is an all society problem. There are some opportunities to work together on climate. We've seen bipartisanship at the state and federal levels, lots of financial and electoral incentives, lots of action in the private sector. I think both parties have an incentive to come to the center, right? So for Republicans, it means taking it seriously, and their incentive is they're going to lose. Democrats, I think coming to the center means shedding some of their extremism and their identity politics. And I think their incentive is they keep saying that climate change is an emergency. And I think that if you're not willing to compromise on something that's an emergency, then maybe you don't really believe it's an emergency. Okay, and I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 4 years, and neither does anybody else. But if I had to guess, we're going to see continuing declines in American greenhouse gas emissions, continuing declines in coal, probably continuing increases, at least for a while, in oil and gas. We might see some symbolic things like rolling back the Paris Agreement for the U.S. Certainly, we'll see some cuts in regulation, but my current hypothesis is that these trends will not be affected as much as people think. Quick parting thoughts. I always like to end these talks by saying to my conservative friends, you want to make America great. What would make America greater than leading the clean energy economy, which is coming, whether we like it or not? And we can be the world leading innovators or not. One seems greater than the other. To liberal friends, again, if climate change is really an emergency, then prove that you really believe that and show that you're willing to collaborate and make compromises. And I think to everybody, we tend to have this fatalism about American politics and polarization. But if you look at almost every objective measure of well-being, this is one of the greatest societies, not only now, but in the history of the world, including in all the ways that conservatives and liberals think it's bad. So let's act like we believe in ourselves. Thank you. Sorry, I did go a little bit over time.
Thanks, Matt. It's okay. I accounted for that for not just you, but
Okay.
for us in general. So no
Yeah.
worries. With the transition time and everything, that always happens. All right. So, just we did have a little bit of chatter, and I just want to address that before we send you off, Matt.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to stick around too. I don't have a hard stop.
Thank you. So it sounds like, um, what do you, maybe this is one thing I'll address because I was also thinking about it. You were talking about how, Congress was very supportive of funding our type of work in the last Trump administration, but now we have different Congress. Do you have any thoughts about how that might affect, funding this time around
Yeah,
for
I mean,
general support?
you have a different Congress. I have another blog post on this. All right, so there's all these stories about how there's a big red wave, and I think that that's true at the top of the ticket. But it's more complicated in Congress, right? Like Democrats lost the Senate mostly because it was a really bad map for them this year, not because they lost. So I think there's like 5 swing states that were up for Senate elections, and I think the Democrats won 4 of them. So so anyway, I think there's a 3-seat majority in the Senate right now. One of those seats is John Curtis, who used to be the head of the Conservative Climate Caucus in the House. So we'll see what he's willing to put up with, right? In terms of kind of hardline stuff. And then in the House, it's like a 5-seat majority or something. It was like a 10-seat majority, and then they kept nominating their members for cabinet positions. And Gates quit, right? So it's a different Congress, but I don't think that it's necessarily a more kind of hardline conservative Congress than it would have been, the last time the Republicans controlled the House and Senate. And then in terms of the incentives for, there's a lot of preference falsification on both sides of the spectrum, right? Preference falsification is where that's based on this book, Private Truths, Public Lies, right? I had the opportunity to talk to like a decent number of politicians on both sides of the aisle about this, and politicians are more moderate than you think they are too. But certainly there are these like public incentives, so we're seeing this right now with the cabinet appointments, who's willing to cross Trump and Elon publicly, so there's some of that. I think it remains to be seen in terms of policies, but certainly it's the case that at the last time Republicans controlled the Congress, there were important Republican voices, including one from Colorado, that played a role in keeping the climate science funding. And I don't see kind of a clear sign that the Congress is super different in that way. It just, I guess, remains to be seen kind of what the how much pressure is put on from the top. The other thing that's interesting about Trump is in some ways he's more powerful this time, but he's also, can't run for a third term. Um, so, as his term goes on, it'll be interesting to see if that changes the calculation at all.
Yeah, thank you. If you don't mind, we had a request for some links to some of your
Oh yeah,
posts in
sure,
the chat. Um, but otherwise, I'm gonna keep us moving. Thanks for that response, though, and thanks for being here. Those are some
sure.
helpful perspectives.
And just Jen Pierce from Boise State, I'll send you an email. Happy to do it. Thanks for asking. Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.